I never thought I'd witness someone bold enough to block an ambulance, especially during a life-threatening emergency. But in our quiet little community, HOA President Deborah Williams thought her rules mattered more than saving a life. What she didn't realize was who she was messing with. My mother, Patricia Anderson, wasn't just another resident. She was the chief of police. And when you mess with the law messes back. This is a story of entitlement, power trips, and the ultimate downfall of an HOA dictator. Before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. My mom had been staying with me while recovering from knee surgery. She's tough as nails and rarely complains, which is why when she called out to me one afternoon saying she couldn't breathe properly, I knew something was seriously wrong. Her face had turned pale and she was clutching her chest. Without hesitation, I dialed 911, and the dispatcher assured me an ambulance would arrive within minutes. Living in a gated community has its perks, but during emergencies, those gates can be more of a hindrance than a help. I rushed outside to make sure the ambulance could get in without delay. That's when I spotted Deborah marching across the street toward my house, clipboard in hand, her perfectly coiffed blonde bob bouncing with each determined step. Great timing as always. "Excuse me, David, but I notice you haven't trimmed your hedge to regulation 36 inches as specified in the HOA bylaws, Section 12, Paragraph 3, she announced in that grating, sing-song voice that made my skin crawl. I couldn't believe this was happening now of all times. "Deborah, my mother is having a medical emergency. The ambulance is on its way. We can discuss the hedges later." I replied as calmly as possible, though my heart was racing with worry for my mom. She glanced at my front door, then back at me with narrowed eyes. Well, medical emergency or not, rules are rules. And speaking of rules, ambulances aren't permitted to use their sirens in our neighborhood after 6 p.m. It disturbs the peace. She actually tapped her watch as if to emphasize her point. It wasn't even close to 6 yet, but that was beside the point. The distant wail of sirens caught my attention, and relief washed over me. Help was finally coming from my mom, but Deborah's expression changed to one of determination as she heard the same sound. "I'll need to speak with them about proper protocol in our community," she declared, puffing up her chest like she was about to confront invaders rather than emergency medical technicians. "Deborah, please, this is serious," I pleaded, trying to reason with her. But reasoning with Deborah Williams was like trying to convince a brick wall to move. Impossible and frustrating. The ambulance approached our community gates, and to my horror, Deborah sprinted toward her car parked nearby. "I'll meet them at the entrance," she called back over her shoulder. She actually planned to intercept an ambulance on an emergency call. I couldn't leave my mother alone inside, so I rushed back to check on her while dialing my phone. Mom was still conscious, but clearly in distress. "The ambulance is almost here. Mom, hang in there," I assured her, though I was now worried about what Deborah might do. What I didn't mention to Deborah in our brief exchange was that my mother, Patricia Anderson, wasn't just any patient. She was the chief of police in our city. Currently on medical leave, yes, but still very much respected and connected. Through the window, I could see Deborah's white SUV speeding toward the community entrance. Quickly, I called Mark, one of the gate security guards who I've become friendly with over the years. "Mark, it's David from House 23. There's an ambulance coming for my mother. Medical emergency. Deborah Williams is heading to the gate now and might try to interfere. Please make sure the ambulance gets through immediately." "Got it, David. Don't worry about Ms. Williams. I'll handle it," Mark replied with understanding. I thanked whatever lucky stars had placed him on duty today. From my window, I could see the drama unfolding at the entrance. The ambulance had arrived, and true to form, Deborah had parked her SUV at an angle that partially blocked the gate entrance. She stood with her arms crossed, apparently lecturing the paramedics who were trying to get past her. Even from this distance, I could see the bewildered looks on their faces. Mark appeared from the security booth and approached Deborah, gesturing for her to move her vehicle. She shook her head vehemently. I couldn't hear the exchange, but her body language said it all. She wasn't budging. The precious minutes ticked by as my mother struggled to breathe in the next room. In a moment of inspiration, I quickly grabbed my mother's police badge from her purse and rushed back to my phone. I snapped a picture of it and texted it to Mark with a message. "The patient is Chief Anderson. Please show this to the paramedics and Deborah." Within moments, I saw Mark show his phone to the paramedics, whose expressions changed instantly. One of them showed the screen to Deborah, whose face went from righteous indignation to shock in the span of a heartbeat. Her mouth actually fell open, and she took a step back, allowing Mark to move her vehicle out of the way himself with a spare set of gate keys. The ambulance finally pulled through and sped toward my house. I met the paramedics at the door and led them to my mother, who, despite her discomfort, still had enough presence of mind to ask what had caused the delay. "Just a small hold-up at the gate, Mom. Nothing to worry about," I said, not wanting to stress her further. As the paramedics assessed her condition, thankfully not a heart attack, but a severe allergic reaction to her new medication, I couldn't help but feel a surge of anger toward Deborah Williams and her ridiculous power trip. Who stops an ambulance to enforce petty HOA rules? The answer was sitting in her white SUV at the community entrance, probably trying to process the fact that she had just tried to obstruct emergency services for the chief of police. I learned that Mom needed to go to the hospital for observation and treatment. As they carefully loaded her into the ambulance, I promised to follow right behind them. What I didn't expect was to find Deborah waiting by my car. Her earlier confidence was now replaced with nervous fidgeting. "David, I had no idea it was Chief Anderson," she said in a hushed tone, as if speaking softly would somehow make her actions less severe. "I was just trying to maintain the standards of our community. You understand, don't you?" Her smile looked painful, stretched across her face like plastic wrap. I took a deep breath before responding, determined not to lose my cool. "Deborah, you tried to prevent emergency medical services from reaching someone in distress. It shouldn't matter if that person is the chief of police or anyone else. That's not maintaining standards. That's potentially endangering lives." Her smile faltered. "I was just doing my job as HOA president. The bylaws clearly state—" "I don't think obstructing emergency vehicles is in any bylaws," I interrupted, my patience wearing thin. "And I'm pretty sure it's against the law. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to get to the hospital to be with my mother." As I moved to get into my car, Deborah placed a hand on my arm, stopping me. "David, please," she said with an edge of desperation in her voice. "I'd appreciate it if we could keep this between us. There's no need for this little misunderstanding to go any further." Little misunderstanding? Was she serious? I gently removed her hand from my arm. "I need to go, Deborah. My mother is waiting." The next few days were focused entirely on my mother's recovery, which progressed smoothly once she was on the right medication. During her hospital stay, several officers from her department came to visit, including her deputy chief, Rodriguez. While Mom was resting, Rodriguez pulled me aside in the hallway. "Your mother told me about what happened with the ambulance," he said. His expression was serious. "She's pretty upset about it, even though she's trying not to show it. Obstructing emergency services is a serious offense." I nodded, still angry about the whole situation, but unsure what to do about it. Deborah Williams lives in her own little world, where HOA rules trump everything else, including common decency and apparently the law. Rodriguez handed me his card. "If you and your mother want to pursue this, give me a call. We take these matters seriously." I thanked him and tucked the card into my wallet, still undecided. When Mom was discharged and we returned home, I was surprised to find an HOA violation notice taped to my front door. The infraction: improper use of emergency services in a residential area, with a fine of $150. The notice was signed by Deborah Williams. I showed it to Mom, who was settling back into my guest room. I expected her to be furious, but instead, she chuckled, which quickly turned into a cough. "Oh, she has no idea what she's done," Mom said when she caught her breath. "Hand me my phone, please." I watched in fascination as my mild-mannered mother, still in recovery, transformed into Chief Anderson before my eyes. She made 3 calls in quick succession, one to the city attorney, one to Rodriguez, and one to the president of the Oakwood Estates Property Management Company, who, as it turned out, was a golfing buddy of hers. The next day, I received an email announcing an emergency HOA board meeting scheduled for that evening. All residents were invited to attend. Mom insisted on going despite my concerns about her health. I wouldn't miss this for the world, she said with a determined glint in her eye. The community clubhouse was packed when we arrived. Chairs had been arranged in rows facing the board table, where Deborah sat front and center, flanked by the other board members. Her expression soured when she spotted us entering, but she quickly masked it with a professional smile. What Deborah didn't notice were the two uniformed police officers who had quietly entered after us, along with a woman in a business suit who I recognized as the city attorney from her visits to our family home. They took seats at the back of the room, observing. Deborah called the meeting to order and began with her usual spiel about community standards and the importance of following HOA regulations. Then she got to the main agenda item, recent abuse of emergency services in our community. It has come to the board's attention that some residents are calling emergency services for non-emergency situations, she announced pointedly, not looking in our direction. This disrupts the peace of our community and diminishes property values. Therefore, the board has decided to implement a new rule requiring residents to seek approval before calling emergency services unless it's a life-threatening situation. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. A few residents raised their hands with questions, but Deborah ignored them and continued. Additionally, any violation of this new policy will result in a fine of $200, which will be used to compensate neighbors for their distress. That's how my mother stood up, despite being in recovery. Chief Patricia Anderson commanded attention the moment she rose from her chair. The room fell silent. "Excuse me, Ms. Williams," Mom began, her voice carrying the authority of her 30 years in law enforcement. "I'd like to address the board regarding this new policy." Deborah's smile tightened. "Chief Anderson, while we appreciate your interest, this matter has already been decided by the board. Perhaps you can bring your concerns to next month's regular meeting." Mom didn't sit down. Instead, she took a step toward the board table. "I'm afraid this can't wait, as your proposed policy is illegal." The room went dead silent. Deborah's face flushed red. "I beg your pardon? Your policy attempting to regulate emergency service calls is illegal," Mom repeated louder this time. "It violates City Ordinance 345.6, which prohibits any person or entity from interfering with or discouraging the use of emergency services. It also violates state law." Deborah sputtered. "This is an HOA matter, not a police matter. With all due respect, Chief Anderson, we have the authority to govern our community as we see fit." Mom nodded to the back of the room, and the city attorney stood up. "Actually, Ms. Williams, you don't. I'm Karen Johnson, city attorney, and I'm here to inform you that not only is your proposed policy illegal, but your actions last week in obstructing an ambulance constitute a Class B misdemeanor under state law." Deborah's face went from red to white in an instant. "I was simply enforcing our community's standards," she protested, but her voice had lost its usual confidence. The attorney continued. "Furthermore, we received reports that you attempted to issue a fine for proper use of emergency services, which constitutes fraud. The city is prepared to file charges unless this matter is resolved immediately." One of the board members, a retired judge named Mr. Patterson, who always seemed uncomfortable with Deborah's tactics, cleared his throat. "I move that we immediately rescind the proposed emergency services policy and cancel any related fines." Another board member quickly seconded the motion. "Wait, you can't just—" Deborah began, but Mr. Patterson cut her off. "I also move that we hold an immediate vote of no confidence in our current president," he added, looking directly at Deborah. The vote was swift and nearly unanimous. Only Deborah herself voted against it. Within minutes, she had been removed as HOA president, with Mr. Patterson appointed as interim until proper elections could be held. As the implications of what had just happened sank in, Deborah gathered her things, her hands shaking visibly. She looked around the room at her neighbors, people who had tolerated her overbearing management for years, but had finally had enough. "This isn't over," she hissed as she passed by our seats on her way out. "I've given everything to this community." Mom simply smiled and replied in a voice just loud enough for those nearby to hear. and the community has given you a $3,000 fine for obstructing emergency services, which you'll be receiving in the mail. Have a lovely evening, Deborah." Deborah's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water as the amount registered. $3,000 plus whatever legal fees she'd incur if she fought it. Without another word, she stormed out of the clubhouse, the door slamming behind her with such force that the HOA Awards plaque bearing her name for excellence in community management fell from the wall and shattered on the floor. At the end of the day, HOAs are meant to help communities, not turn them into personal fiefdoms for power-hungry tyrants. Deborah Williams learned that the hard way when she went from ruling the HOA to getting kicked out in disgrace. But the real takeaway here? No rule, no regulation, and certainly no HOA should ever stand in the way of saving someone's life. And if anyone dares to cross that line, they'd better be prepared for the consequences. What do you think? Should HOAs have this much power? Have you ever had to deal with an over-the-top HOA Karen? Let me know in the comments. And don't forget, if you love this story, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more unbelievable HOA revenge stories.